Hello and welcome everybody to the next episode of the Philosophical Liberal. I am one of the co-founders of 1776 Forward, our sponsoring organization, Chris Bush, and delighted to be joined by my fellow co-founder and co-host, Joia. How you doing today, Joia?
Really good. I'm having a great day and I'm looking forward to this conversation all about greatness.
Yes, me too. Well, as you alluded to, and I'm super excited about this one as well, today we are talking about the question, what is greatness? And this really moves us into the third of our three core values in philosophical liberalism that we have talked about in our statement on the same, and that we are going to continue to reference throughout not only the rest of this series, but the rest of our work and lives building this movement and this new ideal. If you've been following along, we did a deep dive on the previous episodes on first on freedom, the first of the three, and then we just finished our second part of a two-parter on flourishing, and now we move into greatness, which in many ways builds up upon those other two, but it's also more of an edge case in the sense that it's probably the least well understood, well defined, well studied concepts, certainly relative to the other two. But that's also the excitement that this presents for us, and that we're really excited about diving in. So we're going to do that. But first, we wanted to just close out our call to action from the prior episode on Flourishing Part 2. If you listened in, you may recall that our call to action then was to really try to take action, not just mentally, but applying it into our lives. And in particular, Joy and I, we both presented our respective uh, components of our ideal of flourishing. I had my Magnificent Seven, and Joya had her Elite Eight, and we said to pull out one of those respective planks from either of our ideals and see how you might apply them to your own life. And so Joy and I, when we ended that last discussion, we even thought that we would model that ourselves and take the action ourselves by doing the same with each other. So Joy, if you recall that Joy, you had presented your Elite Eight consisted of these dualities or polarities of human identity and excellence. And so I chose the one that was about being authentic, but also being adaptable, and in particular, how I could apply that to my own life. And I had even noted at the time that I wanted to apply it into my work that I'm doing in our other creative, my other creative work on the real estate and architecture side. So after our last discussion over the intervening weeks, the way I thought about it is, and even the way why I even chose that is that a lot of my work, especially since I went on the entrepreneurial route in the last year, has been very independently driven. And so I've gotten to really get close to my own vision and what I want to lead with in my artistic and creative ideals. But it's also not been as engaged and interactive in the market with others. And so I wanted to make sure that what I'm building and designing for takes into account both of these polarities of identity and creativity. So, I've been working on some of the product design for my visions of the future of work that I want to build. And, I had a lot of ideas that I've been thinking through. A lot of my ideating and planning has been taking a first principles approach, which we talk about a lot, of asking questions of what I think the future of work could be and might be, and can in ways that can serve human flourishing and freedom, and doing it in a way that fits with my own aesthetic style and sensibilities. And but I've realized that as I went back and thought about it with this lens, that a lot of that some of my ideas are a little bit more novel. They're untried and untested. So I decided to integrate with the adaptability principle, that I'm going to be undertaking some surveys to gather some market knowledge, and then also kind of comparing versus there's really not an exact equivalent to what I'm looking to do, but at least some of the nearest competitor alternatives, so that I can get some ideas and see what is already out there and being done and works, but that also marries with kind of where I want to take the future of work. So that's one way in which I've been trying to apply now this principle of, if anything, you could say I was a little kind of exclusively focused on the making sure it's authentic to me and my values and ideals, but now trying to marry it with being adaptable and relatable to kind of the wider world.
Well, I'm really excited to see what's going to come out of that then, and maybe hopefully how this principle even will help you make that a reality in your work as it goes forward. So
Yes, and
I'll
thank you
share
for
what
the
I did, and
inspiration.
it's a
Yeah,
perfect
what's
tie-in
yours? Yeah.
because I was especially inspired by the vision of work that you presented. I thought of it as just this heightened sense of what work is, could be, and ought to be all about. And it was interesting because as you were even describing your thoughts about work, you made me realize that when it comes to my day to day approach to work, it's interesting that there's moments when I'm like doing work on my business, I guess you could say, when I'm in that perhaps high altitude space of thinking about the grandness of what it is that I want to build and achieve. But then often when it actually comes to the day to day of getting the work done, I often get in a mode where it feels like I am just checking off tasks on a to do list,
Mm,
completing chores. And so I really tried to bring this heightened sense of work to all of my tasks for the day and
mm,
realized that it even expanded out beyond just the things that I was trying to do for my business. Like I brought it even to the work that I do as a mother trying to raise a
mm,
toddler. I thought about it even in terms of the work that I do around the home, that I try to create an environment for our family as a whole, and just how invigorating that was to bring that heightened work perspective, not just from the grand 30,000-foot view of my purpose, ambitions, and goals, but to even the small minutia of the everyday tasks. So thank you very much for that inspiration. And I think it's going to be a perfect tie-in and segue into what we're exploring today as we head on to explore greatness. And I'm sure you're going to have a lot to say about the greatness of work. But let me turn it over to you because I know we want to start with what we like to call our painter poems, where we really try to evoke in a more artistic, emotional sense what it is that we're after with some of these concepts and then go in to start to break them down. So let me turn it over to you and let's get started on this exploration of greatness.
absolutely. And I love starting with these painters' poems. So, um, the way I even like to think about greatness, and I'm gonna at least refer back to and tie it with our discussions on flourishing, because I really do see them as related. They're distinct for sure, and we're gonna talk about why, but they are related. And I like to see it as almost like on a continuum. And so, in the way that for my painter's poem for flourishing was living up to our full potential, human nature at our best was kind of how I defined it. For greatness, my equivalent is what I call the highest heights of human achievement. And so, I mean, just that one sentence, even for me, that is my official painter's poem. But just to elaborate further, even the way I kind of even see the interrelation between the two and what even helped me get to that is that, I kind of see flourishing as, it's human nature at our best, but it's human nature. So my vision is that that's the standard that all human beings are aiming towards, that is possible in all of our lives. And then greatness is just a higher level of achievement within that, and we'll get into what all that entails and means and looks like. But that to me is kind of how I think about this concept of greatness. And admittedly, I'm still working out and defining, and we're going to really flesh out in these next two episodes even more so. But that was when I even started out thinking about this topic and preparing for these discussions. That was just the royal phrase in my mind.
It's a beautiful phrase, and I have my own phrase, and mine I admittedly did not come up with myself, but I was inspired by Abraham Maslow and the title of one of his books, which I've always loved, which is The Farther Reaches of Human Nature. To me, that's
Mm.
what greatness is all about, is reaching toward the farthest we can with humanity. And for me, greatness to me, the key concept that it always boils down to is this sense of ambition and wanting to push yourself toward, as you call it, the highest of the heights, which I think is most appropriate for a man who wants to build skyscrapers. I couldn't imagine a better phrase that you could possibly have.
Yes, well,
But
there's definitely a artistic personal inspiration there. Or
and with that, I want to say, so that sense of ambition for me, and then that sense of expanding your personal capacity, but even more important, expanding what's possible for humanity. And definitely, we're going to go through a bunch of case studies. And one of the considerations I had with my case studies was even trying to think about the people that try to show us what is possible for humanity and really do try to push the limits of what is possible for human beings.
awesome. Well, between the two of them, your emphasis on the ambition and then mine on the kind of the achievement and reaching those heights, I think we're already onto something. But you know, as these two painters' poems imply, there's a lot more depth to these kind of emotional states. And one point I'd even like to note that Joy and I talked about as we were thinking through this concept, even offline, is and what we're even going to model, I think, going through these next two discussions on greatness is, as we said at the outset, this concept is probably the least well understood, certainly of our three core values. I would argue it's probably one of the least understood concepts just in kind of human nature, flourishing subjects, and the like. Um, so it really is an edge case. We're really kind of going to be defining it ourselves, as much as looking to others who maybe have dived into this topic in the past. And so one way we're going to do that is even by kind of what we see as kind of a model of how knowledge and concept formation works, in that it often starts with an emotional appraisal or reaction that you feel kind of on an emotional, i.e., subconscious level. And that from that, that's your clue, your signal, if you will, that there's something significant here that you want to dive into. So it's not necessarily a source of knowledge. And that's why even these are painter's poem statements, which are more of an emotional feeling that they evoke and expression. They don't give us the full understanding of the concept, but they point the way towards it. So we're going to start there and we're going to actually look at some individuals in history. Actually, we decided we thought it might be good exercise both for us and for purposes of everyone out there listening and watching along, thinking through this topic, to pick out our own kind of examples in history of great men and women, and then hopefully from that start to induce some kind of general themes or concepts so we can build towards our own ideal of this concept. So, unless you have anything you'd like to add, Joy, I was going to turn it over to you to maybe start off by, if you don't mind sharing with us the figures you picked out and kind of anything else you want to say about even your method and process for picking them.
Wonderful. So, and I did have a few things that I wanted to say. I almost think of them as my certain caveats or boundaries for what greatness is all about. And again, greatness is another one of these interesting terms, kind of like freedom, where there is just sort of a very wide definition where when you say something is great, you just sort of are stating that something is, in a sense, a kind of outlier. And when I'm thinking about greatness, I am thinking about greatness that builds from human flourishing. So, for example, we could talk about, we could say Stalin was perhaps a great dictator or a great murderer, but this is not what I mean by greatness. And to your point, this is perhaps ways where even in human history, this is somewhat of an edge case because we're building off of already a concept of flourishing, which in itself has only, as we've kind of been exploring, has only really been taking off perhaps quite recently as we understand this. And so even as we look back historically, like I would argue that there are some people who've been called great by historians, Catherine the Great, Peter the Great, Alexander the Great. Like I'm not really sure that all these people are exactly exemplars of greatness, although perhaps maybe, I'm not exactly, I don't pretend to be an expert historian either. So perhaps maybe people could elucidate some of their greatness to me. But when I'm thinking about greatness, I'm thinking about greatness from this position of flourishing as you expressed it. So that's one consideration.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I kind of realized about greatness, another both and, is that greatness, while it does presume a kind of bedrock of flourishing, maybe a soil of flourishing, if we're going to go
Mm,
with the metaphor of the flowers, that it, on the same token, it also doesn't imply perfection. So as I've
mm,
thought about my
yeah.
exemplars of greatness, these are all individuals who I do think we're human, as the rest of us are. We're not omniscient. We're not infallible. We're not omnipotent, had to go through their own life journeys. And I don't think any one of these individuals ever got everything right. So perfection is not the standard, but there is some measure of excellence by a human flourishing standard that
Mm.
matters. And so I put together a master list. I didn't count up the master list, but my short list I realized already has over 20 names. So I'm sure my master list is more than twice that. And it was difficult even to try to whittle it down. I will share with the audience that when Chris and I first started talking about this, we initially talked about maybe trying to get it down to something like 10 or 12 names, and I admittedly failed. I was not great at all at the task of
Well,
trying
I
to
guess
whittle
that's a
down
good
my
sign
cases
though,
of
right?
greatness.
It's a good sign though, at least in that it reflects that there's probably lots of examples of great figures out there for us to draw from.
Yes, and perhaps something that, to your point, that within the culture, this is not something that we talk about enough to actually put emphasis on this concept of greatness and be asking these questions of who are the people who we think are great and why do we think that they're great.
Right.
And so ultimately, I put on my list people who I thought, in some measure, embodied greatness in both word and deed. And perhaps
Mm,
some of these people embodied it more in their deeds and some of it more
sure.
in their words and their theories. But I tried to pick people who I thought really had something to teach us about greatness in ideally both what they thought and how they lived, or some combination
Mm,
of that. That was
yeah.
some of my criteria. And then some of this was also even just admittedly personal favorites, people who have inspired me in certain ways. And so I realized after I went through my list that I, for example, don't have any great athletes on my list. And I
Mm,
think that's perhaps maybe even just my own personal life and perhaps preferences and predilections. And it's interesting, like I am someone who is interested in fitness, and Joseph Pilates is a personal hero of mine who unfortunately did not make the short list. And I am someone who enjoys watching sports. And I do think that the greatest of our athletes are people who not only develop incredible physical prowess, but also learn how to play what's often called the inner game of whatever sport that they're in. So I
yeah.
think there are ways that some of our great athletes have a lot to teach us, both mentally and physically, about what greatness can entail. But when I was going through my short list and just trying to come up with different categories, I guess I haven't yet figured out who I would pick as my top greatest athletes. And so that didn't yet make the list, but I'm going to put that in as a caveat and something for my own future work that I
I
really
like
think
that.
need to think through that one. But otherwise, unless you had something you wanted to say, I could just start going
No,
through my list, or did you have
yeah,
thoughts
no,
about
that let's
this?
keep, yeah, let's dive in.
So, as I said, ultimately, I have over 20 people. So, just going to give a few little snippets of everyone. And as Chris suggested, what we're doing here really is just essentially putting some names on the table, giving some examples that we can start thinking about so we can ultimately use this as a fertile ground to start inducing some of the important themes of what greatness entails. So I'm admittedly going to give short shrift to all of these wonderful individuals, but
Mhm.
that's the purpose of this, is really hopefully even just to give you a sense of how I was thinking about some of these, some of my own considerations, and hopefully help us put together a grand synthesis of
Yeah. I mean,
greatness.
the way I think about it, certainly it sounds like your approach was similar, is neither of our lists are probably comprehensive for all the great people out there,
Absolutely not.
but and this is what I mean by kind of moving from even that first initial emotional appraisal and signal to then starting to look at concrete examples out in the world so that you can start to identify and differentiate, kind of the similarities and differences to pull out some of those themes. So it sounds familiar, and that's the big caveat here, is we're not by any means claiming to have covered and boiled the ocean. So, but we'll at least try to speak to what themes and filters of significance we used for our respective lists, and then ultimately tie them to this concept that we're trying to build and articulate towards.
So I ultimately grouped my people into different categories. So I'll just go through the different categories, tell you the individuals I selected, and maybe a little bit about why I selected each one. So I
Yeah.
started with whom I called my ancient exemplars. And here I put Socrates, Aristotle, Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, and Confucius. Again, some of this really was personal. Socrates to me, just the emblem of thinking about how to think, and a beautiful example of Socrates is someone who I think would not have recognized greatness in himself. He was always the first person to say that,
Mhm.
he didn't know anything. He was always asking questions, but through that, kind of exemplified the greatness of starting from curiosity and starting perhaps from that place of ambition and openness.
Mhm.
Aristotle, who had so much to say even about greatness itself and thought through this concept, came up with many ethical principles, ideas about virtue. So there's so much we could unpack with Aristotle. We already have, and I'm sure we will in future
Mhm. On
discussions.
flourishing,
And
yeah.
then the great Asian philosophers. So people probably know that I am not a religious person, although I was raised Christian. At this point, I always say that if I had to even pick any of the traditional religions that I thought I was most aligned with, I would pick Taoism. I mean, they came up with all the both ands long before I ever did, and many of them still inspire me greatly. And I also have a background where I've done some martial arts, so there is ways in which those thinkers have definitely impacted my own thoughts about combining mind and body, attention and energy, and how to live a life that has a kind of harmony and integration with nature and and centered within myself. I then fast forwarded through history to who I called my Renaissance era masters. Again, there's so many I could have put in this list, but I
Mhm.
narrowed it down to the three that have been most impactful for me personally. I picked Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Shakespeare. Leonardo, just I think always the preeminent example of a polymath, which I
Mhm.
always aspire to, and so much to teach us about how to be a polymath and blending both art and science, observation and achievement. Michelangelo, just his drive, his dedication, and just his vision of man's, and it really is man's potential, what he achieved
Mhm.
through works like the David and the Sistine Chapel. And just really even, he had a vision that man could be and ought to be great, that he really tried to portray through his works in a way that's always resonated very deeply with me. Shakespeare is another interesting one here. My favorite book that I've read about Shakespeare is the Will in the World book that points out to us all the ways in which we don't know that much about the actual biographical Shakespeare beyond
Mhm.
the work that he produced. But to me, one of the most fascinating things about Shakespeare was how he really did try to take in everything, the high and the low, and combine it all into something of beauty, that he really went in depth into the intricacies of the psychology and the conflicts of kings and queens and great men, and also told fart jokes and would have been easily hanging around with the bottom and the lowest class citizens. So there really was that way in which he kind of embraced humanity as a total, and really I think tried to bring out the joy, the suffering, and the beauty of the human experience. I then went to my political luminaries, and here it's probably significant that I picked people in American history. I guess just the way that America has always been a symbol to me of freedom and humanity striving for freedom and to create that and make that a political reality. I grouped
Mhm.
all of the American founders together because my list was already super long. So I wasn't going to try to even
We'll give you
list
a
them
pass
out.
on that one, yeah.
Yes, but definitely all. the great creators of the Declaration, the Constitution, who really started out America with that promise of freedom. And then just another personal hero of mine is Frederick Douglass, just an individual I think who in a situation of extreme adversity shows what is possible. And again, another individual who just had that glorious sense of human potential and was able to really strive for that and show us what is possible, even in incredibly adverse circumstances and situations. I then kind of went back and thought about the scientists who have inspired me the most. And again, I
Mhm.
come from this as someone who is not at all a professional scientist, but it's even on my list of like things that I want to understand. And so on my list, I have Newton and Darwin and Einstein. I will be the first to admit that I do not understand the intricacies of physics as Newton and Einstein understood them, but
Mm.
I've enjoyed reading their biographies. It's definitely on my to-do list of things that I still have to explore and learn to understand better about the world. And I have such appreciation for how these men really pushed forward our paradigms of what science is and what our understanding, the human understanding of what the world is. I guess this ties it back to a theme that I was already addressing, that these are individuals who really push the limits of what is possible for our human experience. I guess I didn't draw out the ways that some of my other figures did that, but it's perhaps implicit in some of the things that I've said. But again, so here are my scientists who I think have really done that within our knowledge of how the world works and operates. I then uh, honed in on two people who I called my literary philosophers of the great man. And here I put Nietzsche, who famously came up with the concept of the Übermensch, and Ayn Rand, who wrote philosophical novels, where her whole project was to define and project what she called the ideal man. So, again, here, just two other thinkers who I think were among those who have taken human greatness seriously and really tried to do something to show us what is possible for humanity and portray it both philosophically but through artistic and specifically literary projections. And it's perhaps a tie into my next category, whom I called my 19th century visionaries. I
Mm.
realized that one of the greatest advances of human history that I can think of is the Industrial Revolution. And I didn't have any figures who I think actually embody the promise of the Industrial Revolution. It's something else to have to add to my list of the greats. But I did have three 19th century
Mhm.
figures who I think really appreciated that moment in time and really tried to build on it. And so I picked Walt Whitman, I think the poet of that era. Louis Sullivan, just another personal hero of mine, the architect who really tried to build the modern architecture with all his appreciation for his mighty men and the power of willing, power that humans have to will and bring into the world our creations through our will. And then I also picked Maria Montessori, who I think had just some ingenious ideas about how we can educate the youngest of our humans so that they grow into individuals who are capable of realizing human potential. So, again, just other people who I thought had important things to say. And I think building on the fruits of the Industrial Revolution. I then came to my whom I called my 20th century grand theorists. And here I put Abraham Maslow, Viktor Frankl, and Joseph Campbell. Maslow and Frankl I've kind of talked about before, but again, all of these men were, again, people who I think thought very deeply and took very seriously this project of what is possible for
Mhm.
humanity. And as I labeled them here, really tried to come up with grand theories. Maslow with his concept of self actualization, Frankl with his ideas of logotherapy and the drive for meaning, and then Joseph Campbell, who's most famous for giving us the concept of the hero's journey and his just grand sweeping study of the mythology of all of human history and trying to integrate that into a theory of what the hero does, the hero's
Mm.
journey. So just again, that elevated sense of human potential. And then finally, I brought it to our contemporary moment, and three individuals I think who really try to push us in this day and age to see the great possibilities that lie ahead of us in the 21st century. And so here I put Peter Diamandis, who wrote Abundance, Bold, The Future is Faster Than You Think. He's famous for the concept of the moonshot, I think really inspiring people, with that vision of abundance and really to push for like what is that grand moonshot that you can go out to try to achieve. And all these three men have worked together. So Stephen Kotler wrote the books with Peter Diamandis, but Stephen Kotler also runs the Flow Research Collective. He's
Mm,
written books on his own. Perhaps the most important in this context is The Art of the Impossible, where he's really done a lot of deep work to understand flow, which is the science of optimal psychology, the flow state, which is where we think our best and perform our best. And as the art of the impossible suggests, like what it is that we can do to push forward both what's our own personal, what's personally been impossible to us, and then also what's been impossible thus far in humanity and kind of raising the bar on humanity's possibilities. And then Dan Sullivan, who also works with these other two gentlemen and runs the strategic coach, wrote 10x is easier than 2x with this idea. Oh, I called these people, I think I said, my contemporary champions of exponentialism. I think that's even the way
mm,
they think about this, is how to
yeah.
live a 2x or a 10x life as opposed to just a 2x life. And that was even the title of Dan Sullivan's book. And Dan
Mm,
Sullivan is perhaps most famous for entrepreneurial concepts like who, not how, and the gap and the gain. But one of his most important that's relevant to this, which I think is brilliant, and how I'm even going to end this concept of greatness, is he has a model that he calls the four C's. And this comes from the fact that he's observed that sometimes a lot of what holds people back is people lack confidence, and that they often think that, well, if I had more confidence, I would go out and attempt to do these great things. And his
mm,
4C model points out that confidence actually comes last, and it starts with the first two C's, which are commitment and courage. So first, you actually have to have that ambition for the great vision and goal that you project, and you have to, one, have commitment toward it and
mm,
courage to make it happen. And once you do that, then you actually work toward it. That's how you build up the third C, which is your capability or capacity. And
mm.
then it's precisely only then by building up your capabilities, your capacities, that you then gain confidence. So I think just a helpful model to help us think about how we can all bring more greatness into our lives.
Wow, that is awesome. And I mean, I want to hear what's behind even that list, because if that's the short list, then I can only imagine all the other great men and women who are behind that. Um, I guess, hearing you run through all of them, I thank you for the description on the last three in particular. Um, I think most of the other names you mentioned are somewhat well known, in kind of the popular consciousness, although I don't think we often are trained to focus in on thinking about those figures in this way about,
Mhm.
why they represent human greatness. I mean, I think part of why they're elevated in the public mind is that there's probably some inherent kind of identification of greatness going on, but it's definitely not at the explicit or conscious level. But it was frankly those last three that I think most people, myself even included, are a little less familiar with. So I was gonna start by just asking you, kind of what you think they add, perhaps even over and above the prior category or 20th century theorists on greatness, kind of are they a continuation of those thinkers, or are they adding something new to the mix here that's significant and that we should be keeping in mind?
I think there is a real way in which they, to borrow a line from one of my other greats, Newton, they are standing on the shoulders of giants. To me, they're important because they are relevant and they are speaking to the challenges that we face in this day and age. They're all, I think, um, massively tuned into the technology of the moment and what that could do for us and the potential for abundance and growth that comes with that, which is obviously something that none of our pre like, well, all of our previous thinkers can help us with timeless lessons about greatness. These
Mm,
are three thinkers who are thinking very deeply and seriously about that in our moment, who I think can kind of help us kind of almost bridge that gap of kind of taking some of the timeless lessons and thinking about, well, how does this apply to a world where, we're really on the cusp of this like AI revolution where, from the perspectives on like technology from what Peter Diamandis does, like Dan Sullivan, entrepreneurship is still relatively new in human history, and even just the technology we have has made it possible for more people more than ever to be entrepreneurs. We're living
yeah,
into
that's
an
true.
era where almost everyone can and ought to be entrepreneurial. There's a way in which perhaps you and I would argue that there's aspects of entrepreneurship that really are applicable for everyone for flourishing, but there is a
Mhm.
way in which the economy in which we are rapidly advancing into requires more and more of that. So just Dan Sullivan, someone who kind of knows a lot about that, and then Stephen Kotler, who's really just done the best on flow state and really bringing even just Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's ideas, which from the mid 20th century, bringing them up to date and integrating them with the latest in neuroscience has been even his special focus, so that he's really on the cutting edge of like what can we understand at a deep biological level to help more people get into flow and
Yeah.
have optimal experiences and optimal performance.
Did he and Csikszentmihalyi overlap or work together, collaborate at all, or were they? Or is he really kind of just picking up on his work?
I mean, I mean, Csikszentmihalyi only passed away a few years ago, and so I would imagine that they certainly had opportunity to meet, but I'm not quite sure what their specific connection is. But I know, like I've done courses with the Flow Research Collective, which is Stephen Kotler's organization,
Right, right.
and I mean, and that's really what I mean. His emphasis on this has been even to take the the psychology of flow and even bring it more toward the neuroscience of flow. That's really
I
been more
see.
of
Yep,
his
that's kind of what I was
specialty,
getting at
and to
is
really
like,
put it, and he has a background as a writer, and he had done a lot of work studying sports, and so that was even his personal story of how he got into being interested in flow. Like there was just like his observation of what was happening in certain sports where like athletes were just continually getting better and better and better. And it would seem like they were continually just like breaking records, and how was that happening and what was going on. And then he has like his own personal story of dealing with disease and then going through a flow state experience and that helping him. And I mean, there's a whole rabbit hole you could go down with
yeah,
that. But I would say the key thing there is really that he's on the cutting edge for, what we can understand about flow and how to apply it to more people.
sure, sure. And then, the other question I was mulling as you were going through your list is I noted your categories. There was somewhat of a, or maybe entirely a kind of chronological ordering or grouping to them, a little bit of thematic thrown in there as well. Um, I'm just curious, what that signals to you, if anything, in relation to this concept of greatness that we're trying to tease out, and or if those categories aren't necessarily significant, maybe some early patterns or themes that you do draw from this short list, this non-short short list that you came up with.
Well, there is something that I did notice here too. So, I mean, this was obviously the short list from the longer list, and I
All
had
right.
more historical people. I left maybe more of the historical people off, but I did notice that my list definitely included more more people within the past couple hundred years, and it almost seems like there's sort of an acceleration of work and greatness, and I don't think that that's coincidental, especially the way in which you and I think of greatness as being synonymous with human flourishing. That what's happened is as human knowledge has expanded, that we're seeing more and more people build upon that knowledge in productive ways. And I also don't think it's coincidental that we have more freedom now than before, so
That's
there's even
Yep.
just more opportunity for people to be asking these questions and doing this work and building up on this. So I don't think that it is coincidental that there is this kind of acceleration as we get closer and closer to modern times.
Wow, yeah, that's a great insight. And you beat me to the punch, but I was going to say the same thing. It's not only more knowledge, but more freedom, at least as I see it, as a critical ingredient here. So yeah, I think you're right that there's a correlation there, if not, even some line of causality. Awesome.
Anything else, or should we dive in and start to explore yours?
Let's dive
I'm
into
excited to
my
hear your list.
admittedly also non-short list. Mine is a little shorter than yours, but as I kind of previewed, my process was similar, kind of at the meta level, in that I kind of was scanning the universe of both people that are great for many, or considered great, or at least noteworthy for their achievements, particularly in the material, intellectual, personal realms, as well as then some of my own personal heroes and inspirations, and then trying to draw from that. And, my original list I noted had like over 50 names. And then I kind of winnowed it down to about 15 of those. So, um, and kind of again, I started with more an emotional appraisal of, like I said, people who just were heroes and inspired me, which led me to start asking questions of why. And then from there, I could start to even apply some of those lessons to then the other names I was adding to the list. And kind of in a beautiful iterative cycle, you start to see some of the patterns, and then can further filter who you add into it. I will add that, as we are entering the AI age and we're trying to model, kind of utilizing tools and technologies to help us, think and do more with less. I also utilized ChatGPT to also help me refine my list. Interestingly, it came up with probably more names that I disagreed with than agreed with, but that was it frankly just gave me further fuel to then start to see some of the themes that were coming out for me. And I would say some of the key themes that stood out in my own filter of making my list was, um, I noticed I was screening for people who had, well, certainly the polymathic ability, and in particular, excellence of ability across multiple domains was something that stood out. And that to me is a clear analog and bridge to the Renaissance human ideal that we talked about in at least my conception of flourishing, one of my Magnificent Seven in the prior episode. An unbreached integrity to their vision and their ideas or ideals, whatever it was that they were working towards. Um, Kind of a focus on character and mental development. Um, Often, although not all the time, often kind of bucking convention and society. And related to this, a core one, this is another bridge to my thoughts on the creator trader ideal, and work being the central life purpose, again back in what we talked about in flourishing. um, I am really drawn to figures who, what I call, have worldwide creative transformations and transformative impact. And so often inherent in that to me is not just doing something excellently, at the highest standard or quality, better than, if you will, even anyone else from a comparative perspective. But frankly, to me, the comparison is what's less relevant. That's what most of the world operates on. It's those who make something new and that transforms the world, that expands our vision, that is key. And so inherently then, to tie it back to the point about bucking convention or the status quo, inherently when you add something new, often that creates conflict. And then I realized also people who, either directly through their actions and even their word and deed, as you put it, or indirectly and implicitly through their example, that they also elevated our conception of greatness, or at least inspired more people to see what's possible in life by their example, number one. And then number two, that they work to advance freedom. Because, and this is where we tie it back even to our whole project, and we're going to a couple sessions from now. That to me is just a critical component. So, I guess I'm leading here with some of the themes that started to stick out for me that I used as for my filter. And then I guess from the 50 plus names that I came up with from that, I then tried to, in filtering my tops, I looked for people who screened well across as many of those kind of characteristics as possible. So that was kind of how I came down to it. And then I grouped them like you did, but by some of the themes, some of the ones that I just mentioned. And you pointed out when I kind of shared my initial notes on this, I used the terminology of expanders for each of these. I grouped it into four categories that we're going to go into, but I expanders. So I think definitely this idea of expanding human understanding, reach, potential, and and character, whatever, that is a key component as well. So diving in, my first grouping was what I call expanders of human mind, understanding, or vision. And this is essentially the philosophers, the kind of great men and women of the mind. I had Socrates, Aristotle, Buddha, and Ayn Rand. And so, and again, I'm just keeping it to a short list here of people who registered well. So this probably isn't even my ultimate final list, but it's at least, kind of a narrowed list. And for these four, I chose, I guess, going through um, Socrates, because in many ways he was the first philosopher, the first man to ask why. And as we've talked about in past sessions, even why from like a truly first principles, let's understand the world so that we can make a better one for humans and human life. That was key to me. And his curiosity, the fundamental curiosity embedded in the Socratic method, and then this unbreached integrity concept that he literally gave his life for the sake of his ideas and ideals, and certainly was constantly challenging the status quo in so doing, but kicked off the whole of Western philosophy and how we think and know everything. And so, in that way, totally expanded our vision. Aristotle, because in many ways, he perhaps, unlike Socrates, who you rightly noted, would not have thought of himself as great. Aristotle, I think, was perhaps the first great thinker to really think about this concept of greatness. We talked a lot about in the context of flourishing, his thoughts about eudaimonia and kind of that being a state of activity. But he also talked about kind of the great souled man, as he called it. I believe the official Greek was, I wrote it down,
Psychus, yeah, megalocycus, I think it is.
yeah, megalopsychia.
It almost sounds like a dinosaur, but much
It
cooler.
does. It does. And even his concept of the golden mean. So, and in particular, his emphasizing of character as a key component of greatness. Buddha, because, and I think you rightly pointed out, even with Lao Tzu, but I think this is true of all three of perhaps the great Chinese and East Asian philosophers, ancient philosophers of Confucius, Buddha, and Lao Tzu. Um, is that he really grasped these polarities of identity and the importance of balance, and in particular of mental control, discipline, and focus, and how peace and strength as a human being comes through that. So that is what inspires me about him as well. And then Ayn Rand, I think, as you wonderfully put, in many ways, her whole life's work was built on identifying and defining and projecting her ideal of what greatness in human beings represents. And to me, she was great. She represented greatness on so many levels, not just that she thought about it consciously as a project, but also that she was an artist and a writer herself, that she, rare among philosophers, tried to depict her ideas through art and through kind of a concrete metaphysical expression and demonstration of it, and they're amazing novels that are life changing and world changing. And then she obviously tried to practice what she preached. So those were my four there. My second category is what I call expanders of human domain, territory, reach, and exploration. So this is really what I think of as the explorers, who really literally and figuratively expanded human boundaries and territories. And here I had Galileo Galilei, Christopher Columbus, and Alexander the Great. And now I know you reference Alexander originally as maybe perhaps someone not the great. My case that I'll make for him here is that yes, he was a conqueror, and this actually leads to one point I want to make here. You kind of touched on it, but I try to judge these figures within the context of their time, not with the full benefit of human knowledge and morality and philosophy that we now have built up, but where they were in their time. And I think, again, I'm not a historian by trade and a historic expert by any means, but know enough to be dangerous. And kind of my take on him and why I included him even above all the other greats that are named throughout history is that he's widely attributed with kicking off the what's called the Hellenistic period in history, which meant that he really took Greek culture and expanded it. Yes, it was through conquest and imperialism, but what made it different perhaps than even other conquerors of his era and even those that came after was that he was spreading kind of the Greek ideal, which did have respect for other cultures, was more relatively humane and rational by those standards, and critically advanced Greek culture, which in many ways, I think set the foundation for so many other good values and humanistic values that modern humanity has built off of. Galileo,
including freedom,
including
most
freedom,
importantly.
exactly, yes. So Galileo, I mean, he literally expanded and altered our understanding of the universe. And like Socrates, he paid with it for he paid for it with his life. And so, that just, but, unbreached integrity to what he saw and expanded everything we know. And then Christopher Columbus, again, you know, stepping out into uncharted territory. He's the literal definition of it, right? Going out into the seas at a time when people literally thought the world was flat, nobody knew differently, and he, was going to go kind of prove otherwise and also expand. Yes, again, it was a kind of imperial banner or flag, but also that he was kind of bringing at the time Western culture to the New World, and just even that fundamental curiosity and courage to go where no man has gone before and move the world forward. My third category is what I call expanders of human liberty, back to that theme of liberty. And like you, mine is very heavily concentrated around Americans and the American founding for reasons we've well discussed. I won't repeat. John Locke, I include in here. I actually chose three of my favorite founders. I agree with you. I could include all of them, but I particularly pulled out George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and Ben Franklin, in part because all three of them, to me, were three of the most diverse polymaths among the founders. Certainly, at least had some of the widest impact in multiple fields that demonstrated that polymathic ability and excellence. Um, and in different ways they represented that character theme of great character, and then also the intellectual and philosophical focus, and so many other great things that they achieved. And then Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, who I see as both two of the icons of the abolitionist movement. And Harriet Tubman, I give credit to. I mean, talk about also risking everything and unbreached integrity. And also, I mean, there are few women on my list, but when I think about, kind of great humans, it's both. And few men or women have done what she's done to advance human liberty, and also to have come from such kind of challenged circumstances, but had that grit and perseverance. And then my last category is expanders of human creativity and ambition, kind of going back to the creator trader ideal and the centrality of work. And and I had five names here, two from the Renaissance and three from modern times: Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Buonarroti, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, and then a personal favorite, Larry Silverstein, who I actually had the privilege of working with, but just taking them in turn. Leonardo. I mean, there's few more exemplars of human excellence and greatness on so many dimensions as him. Michelangelo, like you know, I think he just showed, and your two examples, both in sculpture and painting, two of the greatest works in human history, the David sculpture and then the Sistine Chapel mural, you know, just he showed what's possible in different domains and also yet pro-human, like you said, and just elevated beauty as a value and showed us when we say he showed us what's possible, it's what human beings can make and the world, what it can look like in our hands. You know, I think he uniquely demonstrated. Steve Jobs, in many ways, I feel like is a modern version of that, but also combine the technology and engineering side, and then also the business and entrepreneurial side. So in many ways, that even is kind of a modern variation of polymathic excellence and ability. Um, and he uniquely, I think, recognized the importance of beauty again as a value, an aesthetic value, that we are human beings of materialism as well, and that our physical world and products should be beautiful and enjoyable and easy to use, make life easier. Elon Musk, you know, in many ways, I see him, there's echoes of Leonardo, the Leonardo of our time, in the sense of, you know, kind of certainly his polymathic ability, um, his that wide-ranging scope. I mean, the fact that he's literally helping us be multiplanetary, and then even I think that kind of transcendent sense of mission. You know, obviously he gets knocked by many critics today for, you know, kind of being messianic. But there is something too, I think, you know, we talked about self-transcendence as being a mission grander than yourself, and he is definitely genuine and sincere in wanting to build the conditions for humanity to survive and to thrive, not just on Earth, but, you know, into the universe beyond. So to me, those that's critical for him. And then Larry Silverstein, like I said, is you know, I get the pleasure of having one of my heroes that I actually got to know and work with directly. I often lament, frankly, that I feel like I don't get to see many examples of greatness, you know, in our modern world, although which is interesting given what you said about possibly we're getting more examples now. So we'll maybe talk through that. But he was one, frankly, and part of what even drew me to him, he was the rebuilder of the World Trade Center, for those who aren't familiar with him, the owner during the 9/11 attacks, and then the rebuilder there afterwards. And I took just a that became a personal love project of mine to help rebuild in that effort, because of what it meant to me about restoring the greatness of Wall Street, the financial capital of New York City and America, which in many ways are the highest heights of achievement for our civilization. And he uniquely stood alone against all of the culture of that time, 25 years ago almost now. Even then was turning against freedom, against achievement, against productivity. I remember Michael Bloomberg, the mayor of the city at the time, wanted to turn it into parks and housing right in the heart of the greatest financial center the world has ever known. And Larry was just indefatigable. And he said, nope, we're rebuilding the commercial core bigger, better, and taller than before, which to me was the right exact spirit, both as response to the terrorists who took down the towers and all those beautiful lives, and also just as the spirit of progress that should always animate us, and that New York City and America uniquely and chiefly represent, perhaps more than any other places on Earth. So, and he also just was a great human being. I remember some of the best advice I've ever gotten was from him when I first started out working for him. It was, you know, one of the best decisions you'll ever make for your career is who you choose as your life partner. And now, however many years ago that is, 20 years ago now, I definitely see the truth in that wisdom and advice. So I'm also very grateful for him because it stuck with me. And I think I made the right choice. So, and actually, I know I made the right choice. So I took it to heart.
literally took a tart.
Yes, quite.
Thank you so much for sharing your list. Now you're making me realize that my long, short list was not long enough because so many of your figures were on my, admittedly on my longer list, but you even added a few. Give me new perspective, perhaps, on people like Alexander. And I do agree that I think it is important that we do try to judge these people in their own time for the achievements that they had in their own time, given their own context, kind of judging them on their own terms in that way. And also to this point that none of our figures are perfect by any
Right.
means. And perhaps when we factor in some of those historical considerations by our modern standards and our contemporary understanding and everything we know now, we might judge people a little bit more harshly, but none of these people were perfect at all. So I
Yeah.
think that that's an important consideration. I do want to begin even just by picking up from where you left off, because Larry is one of like the only person on both of our lists who is someone that you actually knew. I'd love if you could even just share just a little bit more of your insight from actually knowing someone personally whom you would put on the short list. If you could share just maybe some more insight of what he was like, or what maybe you observed about him that you can share that the rest of us can't get because we weren't insiders the way you were.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I guess working backwards, I'll say as that piece of advice reflects, he had a very humanistic perspective, like I mean, I come from the business world. I worked on Wall Street for 20 years in the financial and corporate real estate worlds. And so I have heard many businessmen, contemporary businessmen, pontificate on that very question. What advice would you give to someone starting out to be successful, to get where you got? Most businessmen answer with some variation of, kind of net people to know or skills to learn or things to do, kind of very, I guess, pragmatic, but almost logistical. And the fact that he answered with something totally unrelated to business, but that reflected a profound insight about even just the integration, like that like because that piece of advice reflects some of the themes we talked about the integration of us as human beings, that as even I tried to articulate in my own ideal on flourishing. Yes, work is the central purpose in life, but it's not the sole purpose or certainly the sole value that gives meaning and importance to it. And so, I think he saw that, and that was true about everything he did. He was gregarious. He was larger than life, but in many ways he embodied a lot of those polarities of character that you want to see. He was big and boisterous, but he was also very, kind of caring and soft and intimate. He was certainly a very benevolent person. New York real estate development families are notorious for, being kind of dynasties. Even the language we use to describe them harkens all the way back to the Renaissance period and before the Medicis and, the banking dynasties or barons, all of which have unfortunately negative connotations. Some of it warranted historically, but not all of it. And he was just not like that. He was very personable. He respected everybody from his secretary to the mayor of New York or the governor of New York, who would come into the office often because the state unfortunately had a lot of say in that project, and that was a big part of even his struggle. And then moving more into, kind of his vision, certainly having the vision, grasping the importance of the what that needed to get rebuilt. Unfortunately, even 25 years ago, our culture was such that it depicted him as the greedy, you know, land baron who was just out for money. But he grasped something more important, which was, in a way, kind of this point about work being central to life, and certainly central to the life of New York City, which is the capital of work, the capital of capitalism. And that's why, because it's a center for creativity and coming together for creating and trading. And Wall Street is the epicenter of that for our entire culture. So he grasped why that was significant. So having that vision, seeing what's important, and then just, I mean, his incredible persistence and grit. I mean, it's even now, there's still two sites that have not been built. Two out of like 7 or 8 of the buildings that were originally planned 15, 20 years ago have still not been built because of just all the delays and the fights he's had with the government at multiple levels, as well as other private parties who tried to steal the site from him multiple occasions. And he never wavered, and he just had that vision. He had his amazing wife who stood by him for everything. He made that commitment, and that carried him through all of the ups and downs. You talked about the example of your grandmother and beautifully in the last session about, kind of to reference the idea of happiness, about kind of an unshakable core. And in many ways, I feel like that's perhaps what I learned from him, is that when you have some of these elements that we're talking about, that provides kind of your another dimension of an unshakable core that gives you the fuel to go on and fight when you are, bucking consensus, bucking society, trying to introduce something new, trying to expand horizons, trying to stand up for liberty. And part of why I think that's even one of my significant filters is that I realize freedom, in many ways, freedom is still the exception and is still the anti consensus ideal politically. And so those who fight for it, either consciously, directly, or implicitly, are still fighting that fight to expand human potential and capacity. So those are some of the themes that stand out most from my time working with him and why they inspired me so much.
Well, it's a beautiful tribute, so I hope everyone who knows and loves him will find this, even just for that tribute that you've given him. I want to ask one more question, and I want to pull out this observation that I had when you sent me your list, that all of your categories were all about expansion, and you said a
Mm,
little bit about that. I'd love to hear you say more, and specifically, I'd love to hear your thoughts about how it ties to your ideas about work, especially since that was my project this past.
yeah.
Uh, you since our last session, with thinking about this heightened sense of work, I'm wondering if you, now that we've kind of gone through all of this, if there's any interesting observations or connections you can draw about this concept of greatness as expansion and what that might mean for what work is at its best.
Ooh, good question. Um, well, it's funny when you first noted that right before we got on. um, I pointed out, while I used that term to kind of tie my 4 categories together, to me initially the more significant point was the 4 categories, because those were like 4 themes that I saw kind of paralleled for all of the my short list across all of them. I should note, by the way, I grouped them, of my 15 names or so, I grouped them in one of those 4 categories only by because I just need to create some categories. So I chose to put them in one that I thought was most essential to them. But in my mind, part of why those 15 registered was because they registered on all 4 categories. But once you pointed it out, and then the fact that I used the terminology of expansion for all of them, you hit onto something. So I think, yeah, as I think through it, I think this notion of growth is key. We even talked about it in Flourishing, that our ideal that we say of human nature at our best is creator trader pursuing continuous betterment. And that in many ways is continuous betterment is the end that freedom allows, and kind of almost is what freedom aims towards, is continuous betterment. And you need freedom to do that. So it's kind of like an iterative virtuous cycle. And so to me that's just inherent to human life. I mean, in many ways, you just break it down to life as such. The choice is survive or die, live or die, survive, or not. And that requires a process of constant action and growth, really. So to me, that just is inherent to progress. And then I think to tie it to work, um, and that's what I'm getting at is like, so in order for humanity to progress, which is our purpose, it's at least certainly our potential, the great power we have is that we can progress, that we don't have to take the world as it is, but can make it better and more. And then I think tying it to work, that work is really the process by which we do that, at least fundamentally, whatever your sphere of creative impact and effort is, that's really the way in which we grow ourselves, certainly that we expand material goods and services on which human life depends, and the like. So, and to me, then the best forms of work are those that grow by adding something new, by taking the materials around us, rearranging them, combining different elements, and making something new that reflects your unique vision or ideal. You know, obviously, I highlighted five of the greatest creators under my creator category that did that, but to me, that is something that's open to all of us, and definitely a part of this ideal that I want to continue to champion and deepen, is this notion that at any scale of impact, we all have the ability to translate our visions into reality through our creative work.
That does lead to something else that I wanted to ask you about, something that we haven't said yet, but that I know you and I have talked a lot about offline, and I think we need to bring into this conversation, which is this idea of we've talked about greatness as this grand outlier kind of phenomenon. But how does then that relate to, let's say, the masses, right? Usually greatness is opposed to like the masses. And I don't
Mhm.
think that that's, frankly, I don't think that's a useful category or way to think about this. But how do you think about like, is greatness open to everyone? Maybe you can share some thoughts about that as we get ready to wrap this up.
Yeah, well, my short answer is yes, I do believe it is. And one of the things, frankly, that stood out to me as I was going through this is certainly none of my categories or themes that I was looking for and screening against, and even the qualities and characteristics that I admire in the people that made them register on my list in the first place, they're not really about intelligence or ability per se. I mean, yes, certainly Michelangelo, Leonardo, they had exceptional artistic and scientific abilities. But in many cases, if you study their history, it was well and long and hard cultivated, so we can have a whole separate discussion on, kind of talent versus intelligence versus effort, and how the mixture of those, uh, kind of interplays into one's abilities and impact. But to me, they're not the most significant factors. And so, and in particular, as we build towards a kind of meta level synthesis or ideal of greatness, I'm going to argue that it's kind of as much about the character aspects as it is going to be about kind of this expansion, kind of impact on the wider material world around you. And just like in our ideal of flourishing, which I see again, greatness just builds off of that. I don't think any of either my Magnificent Seven or your Elite Eight spoke to any aspect of human nature that is closed to everybody. And so to me, perhaps maybe the way to think about it, as I'm just fleshing this out now, is that the to me, flourishing is something that not only is open to all human beings, but that if we're doing things right, we all will and can achieve, regardless of your ability. Um, it does take effort, of course, but to me, whereas greatness is there is an element of ambition. Perhaps that's maybe the most significant differentiator between the two, is that ambition to kind of rise above or expand beyond kind of the ordinary or just everything else. So that is inherently exclusive, or at least it's narrowing the funnel of human achievement and potential, but only by choice, not by ability. So that's maybe one way I think about it. And maybe we'll talk some more in the next discussion about how perhaps we can help people see this question of ambition and building that up so that we can build towards more people seeing greatness as within their grasp.
Obviously, something I definitely agree with is I started with ambition at the very top of what I talked about with greatness. And I do agree with you. In my mind, ambition is the starting point. It's the thing, it's the fuel, it's the spark and the fuel that really has to be there to get people going, that I think unfortunately is not as present as it could be. But that sometimes the way I think about it is I think there is a kind of both and between the extraordinary and the ordinary, in a way that every ordinary human being has the potential to be extraordinary, especially when we lean into what are our signature strengths, abilities, and really go on that journey of evolving what that is, developing our mission, our vision into this thing that only we can be. And by definition, that will be extraordinary. It will be unlike what everyone or anyone else is doing, and at the same time it ought to be what everyone is doing, but in
Right.
their own way. But
I
let's
like that.
definitely plan to talk about that more, and I can think that already kind of gives a teaser to what our part two on this greatness episode will be. So maybe you can just tell people what they have to look forward to here, and our call to action as well.
Yeah. So as we just alluded to, we want to now build off of all these great case studies and examples we just went through and work towards our own metasynthesis of defining what we mean by greatness, and certainly what we're trying to build a movement towards as it pertains to philosophical liberalism and bring it back to that ideal. So that's going to be our focus on the next discussion, is putting all this together and seeing what we come up with. So to help us in that and kind of mirror us along that journey, our call to action this week is to do a similar exercise, come up with your own list of grades, um, or you can use our lists and start to induce some of your own themes or general principles of either your list or ours that you start to see, and maybe even start to narrow down the ones you think are most significant among those themes and characteristics or attributes, so that we are building towards a definition on greatness, and definitely share it with us, ideally before the next 2 weeks session, so that we can incorporate it even as we're building ours, because we truly have not done it yet. So it is still new territory, new ground to be broken.
Another grand expansion.
Yes.
I'm
Well,
looking forward to it.
yep,
I
me
will
too.
see
That
you
was a
then.
great discussion. Yep. See you in 2 weeks, everybody.